is eating keto or high fat dangerous? And there have been a lot of articles that come across. I have a news search that comes out with keto headlines, and I have seen a lot of articles because there's this one study, and I'll let you tell them about the study, but there's a study that came out, and the problem with a lot of studies is that they look at correlations and they imply causation. So they look at one of my favorite examples that Dr. Ryan Lowry shares is during the summer, murder rates go up. During the summer, ice cream consumption also goes up. So does that mean that a correlation is between ice cream and murder rates? But that doesn't mean ice cream is causing higher murder rates.
Right.
That's inferring causation because of a correlation. Two things are high, but that doesn't mean they're related at all.
But it doesn't mean that we can't draw on that to say, okay, maybe we should go and study this now to see what that correlation means. Maybe it means nothing. Maybe it means something. But, yours, the example she used is ridiculous, but it makes the point, right? That some of these studies are just that. They kind of seem ridiculous. Recently, there's been studies by out of, I think, Yale Medical School or something like that. And it was like, oh, keto is only good for the first week, and then it's bad. Well, and so we started to see articles from bloggers on different, really big blogs, news sites owned by AOL, Verizon, all these places, and they're saying emphatically, like, you can't do the keto diet. It's only good for a week, and then you're just going to get fat, right? Well, the study was done on mice that are genetically bred to be obese and prone to diabetes, regardless of what they eat. Like, they're just bred that way. Not to mention the fact that the food that they're feeding the mice is basically Crisco. That's the fat that they get.
Yeah.
And, like, a small amount of protein. They're, like, getting 10% protein, 90% Crisco. And so that's how they get the animals into ketosis, which you can do that with those substances. But it's not healthy.
Yeah.
That is not a well-formulated ketogenic diet. Not to mention the fact that mice and humans are different when it comes to ketosis, because mice who are allowed to eat whatever they want will just eat until they get fat. Whereas humans, like, I can't possibly do that. Like, I get too full. I can't eat so many calories that I'm going to get fat. Plus, at the end of the day, we metabolize fats differently than mice do. Now, we can draw some inferences from those studies, and they help us point us in, like, okay, how should we study this in humans based on what we know in these other animal studies? Or maybe we should take this to monkeys, and but we're making these wild statements about don't do the keto diet, it's super dangerous because these mice that are bred for obesity and diabetes died. Well, they're bred to die. Like, that's the point.
So, and I think this is a good place to kind of circle back around and say, well, why on our food guidelines, back in the 70s, why was fat demonized? How did fat get picked on? Why were we taught growing up? I mean, I grew up in the fat-free era. So I was taught as a teenager that eating fat would make me fat. Right? So how did that even happen?
If you grew up in the 80s, if you grew up in the 70s and the 80s, that was the message that was plowed into your mind.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I was in, teenage years, and so, everything was fat-free coming onto the shelves. So how did that even happen? So I think it's important, if we go back and we look at Ansel Keys' 7-country study. So that was a study, a whole bunch of middle-aged men.
Right. So Ansel Keys was not a medical doctor. He was a researcher, which arguably a super smart guy, and lived well into his 90s. So a very healthy guy. But he did a study of, I think the actual study was over 20 some odd countries. And he looked at the data.
The first study.
Right.
The first study.
Oh, you want to talk? Go ahead.
I was talking about this. No, I was talking about the 7-country study, because he handpicked 7 countries.
He did study over 20 countries in that study, but he picked 7
for
the data.
Yeah.
That kind of fit the narrative that they were looking for. And it's not all his fault. Like, he did present a lot of data that said other things, but what the media glommed onto and what the U.S. government glommed onto was saturated fat equals bad. And it didn't matter, they didn't really go into what the source of the saturated fat is or what else is being eaten with the saturated fat. It was a
case of correlation being presented as causation.
Right. And so they looked and they said, look, in these 7 countries, they eat more saturated fat and they have more heart disease. Well,
and there were people speaking up. There were other scientists and researchers speaking up and saying, no, that's wrong. No, that's wrong. That's not the problem. And pointing a finger at
sugar, of course. So John Yudkin in 1972 came out with a book called Pure, White, and Deadlies. This is 1972. That sounds like a book that you might see on the bookshelves coming out today.
Today, yeah.
Right? So this is nothing new. What we're learning about here is been talked about for 4 decades. So he comes out with a book, Pure, White, and Deadly, basically gets, ignored in the wider scientific community and in the government circles. And we get the food pyramid and then,
And he went as far to say that if the FDA looked at sugar and all of its negative impacts on human health, took a hard look at sugar as a food additive, let's say it was labeled as some random food additive, they would ban it.
The state of California would say that sugar is known to cause cancer. Like, sugar is known to the state of California to cause, Prop 65, I think it is. That's just how, dangerous that all of the sugar that got added to the food was. But they don't want to look at it like that because at the time there was not a requirement in a lot of scientific studies to what do they call it? Like exposure funding, right? To disclose any ties or material connections you might have to different industries. And people were getting paid to write studies that were favorable to sugar by the sugar industry, and they didn't have to disclose that information. So people trust scientists and trust that they were giving them accurate, honest information that was not biased by industry, when it was actually biased by industry very heavily.
So now we have research that shows the harmful impacts of sugar on our arteries. You want to talk a little bit about what happens to when we have high blood sugar?
Yeah, and the just high blood sugar, cascade. That epithelial lining of your arteries, is the exposure to sugar over long periods of time, the glycation of our red blood cells, that's where we get our A1C number from. It's just causes inflammation, and that inflammation leads to, maybe micro tears or tearing in the artery walls. And then, basically cholesterol's job is to go in and be the Band-Aid. And so it's like looking at a car accident and saying, every time I see a car accident, I see an ambulance. I guess ambulances are the cause of car accidents, right? Well, that's the same way they looked at cholesterol, saying, I guess cholesterol is the reason for all these heart attacks, not the inflammation that's tearing the arteries apart.
Right, and when they say cholesterol, what they mean is dietary fat. They say that dietary fat is causing the high cholesterol, when it's not. It's a combination of a highly processed, highly carbohydrate-laden diet. So we're not just talking about sugar here. We're talking about all carbohydrates. When there's too many, when you're looking at the standard American diet, you can be as high as 70 to 80% carbohydrates. If you look at the old food pyramid that came out in the 70s, on the bottom, what was it, like 10 to 12 servings of grains or something like that? Yeah,
whole grains and grains.
That's too much.
Yeah.
So we've created this problem. So we live in Iowa, which is one of the fattest states in the country. It's something like 40% of people in Iowa are overweight. And so we look around and we see the state of our health. And you have to start to wonder, how can we as a country, as a people, be leaders and, do good in the world and, change the world for the better? There's so many terrible things that happen in the world. And if we're sick and we're dying from diseases that are preventable, if you look at the top 10 causes of death, we'll just do a couple of them. Heart disease. The CDC says 34% of heart disease is preventable with dietary and lifestyle changes.
Right.
Stroke. Again, CDC says 33% could be prevented with dietary and lifestyle changes. And the number one dietary change people could make to get started on that is to reduce carbohydrate intake. And we're not even talking about a full-on ketogenic diet. Let's just go low carb. I mean, just if we could get people to understand how much the highly processed carbohydrates are damaging their bodies and creating a state of unhealth, dishealth, however you want to say that, I mean, we could really see some change. So people don't have to go full ketogenic. They don't have to go full high fat to see benefits from reducing carbohydrate intake. I work with tons of clients who don't start in keto. They start with a 30-day no sugar challenge. Then they move gluten out of their diet, and some people stay right there. They just aim for low carb, no gluten, no added sugars.
Yeah.
And see fantastic results. So hopefully that helped answer the question, is eating keto high fat dangerous, and kind of explained kind of what happened to even demonize fats, especially saturated fats. And it maybe hopefully changed how you look at it, or maybe even